Some people think rules make a neighborhood safe, but what happens when following a rule becomes more important than saving a life? The question ran through Jacob Miller's mind long before anyone else on Maple Ridge Drive realized their quiet Tuesday morning was about to become the story nobody would ever forget. Jacob had lived in the neighborhood for almost 8 years, and routine rarely changed. He watered the flower beds before leaving for work, waved to familiar faces walking their dogs, and always stopped to chat with 82-year-old Eleanor Hayes whenever she sat on her front porch with a cup of tea. She reminded everyone of the grandmother they wished lived next door, kind without being intrusive, cheerful without demanding attention. That morning, however, her porch was empty. As Jacob reached for the garden hose, a faint cry drifted across the neatly trimmed lawns. At first he thought it was the television from an open window, but then he heard it again, weaker this time. He immediately looked toward Eleanor's house and noticed her front door standing slightly open. His stomach tightened. Without thinking twice, he crossed the grass separating their homes, calling her name. "Eleanor? It's Jacob. Are you okay?" There was no answer, only another strained call that sounded urgent enough to erase every ordinary thought from his mind. He stepped onto her walkway, ready to hurry inside and check on her, when another voice cut through the morning air. "Stop right there." Jacob turned and saw Patricia Collins marching across the sidewalk with a clipboard tucked under one arm and her phone already pointed in his direction. As president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, Patricia never missed an opportunity to remind residents that appearances mattered. Her perfectly pressed blazer matched the sharp tone in her voice. "You just walked across common landscaping," she announced. "That's a violation. You need to use the designated pathway." Jacob blinked, certain he had misunderstood. "Patricia, Eleanor needs help." Patricia barely glanced toward the open door. Instead, she lifted her phone higher and snapped another picture. "Rules apply to everyone," she replied calmly. "If residents start ignoring them whenever they feel like it, this neighborhood falls apart." Another weak call came from inside the house. Jacob instinctively took another step forward. Patricia moved directly into his path. "I'm documenting this," she warned. Unauthorized entry onto another property and damage to HOA-maintained grass could result in significant fines. Jacob stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now?" "Completely," Patricia answered. "Emergency or not, procedures exist for a reason." Jacob pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911 while keeping his eyes fixed on Eleanor's doorway. As the dispatcher answered, he explained the situation as quickly as possible, giving the address and describing what he had heard. The dispatcher instructed him to stay nearby and check on Eleanor if it was safe. Jacob nodded, even though she could not see him. "I'm going in," he said firmly. Patricia immediately raised her clipboard. "If you ignore HOA policy, expect formal action." Jacob looked at her for only a second before stepping around her. Behind nearby curtains, neighbors began noticing the commotion. Front doors opened. A man walking his golden retriever stopped on the sidewalk. A teenager quietly lifted a phone to record what was happening. None of them understood the full story yet, but everyone could see one thing with perfect clarity. While one neighbor rushed towards someone who clearly needed help, the president of the HOA seemed determined to argue about rules first. Jacob reached Eleanor's front door just as the dispatcher reminded him to stay calm and keep talking until emergency responders arrived. He gently called Eleanor's name again and found her sitting on the living room floor, leaning against the side of a chair. She looked pale and exhausted, but she was conscious enough to recognize him. "I heard you," she whispered. "I could not get back up." Jacob knelt beside her, careful not to move her unnecessarily. He told the dispatcher exactly what he saw and followed every instruction, speaking in a steady voice that was meant to reassure Eleanor as much as himself. Outside, Patricia Collins remained on the front walkway, tapping notes onto her phone while occasionally taking more photographs. Her expression never changed. Instead of asking whether Eleanor was all right, she began speaking loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. Everyone needs to understand that neighborhood policies exist to prevent confusion during situations like this. Residents cannot simply ignore established procedures. Jacob looked toward the doorway in disbelief. "Patricia, this is not the time." She folded her arms. "Actually, this is exactly when standards matter most. If people abandon rules whenever emotions take over, the entire community suffers." Several neighbors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Michael Turner, who lived across the street, quietly stepped closer and asked if Jacob needed anything. Jacob requested a bottle of water and asked someone to wait outside for the ambulance. Within seconds, Michael hurried away while another neighbor, Denise Walker, stood near the sidewalk and began directing traffic away from Eleanor's driveway, so emergency vehicles would have room to arrive. Their calm cooperation contrasted sharply with Patricia's continued focus on violations. She informed Jacob that crossing landscaped property, leaving a garden hose stretched across his own yard, and entering another residence without prior authorization would all be documented for review by the Homeowners Association Board. Denise stared at her in disbelief. "You are making a list right now?" Patricia answered without hesitation. "My responsibility does not disappear because other people become emotional." More residents stepped outside as word spread from one porch to another. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. Instead, people simply watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. A retired teacher quietly recorded from her porch, believing it might be important later if anyone questioned what had happened. A father walking his young daughter stopped long enough to ask whether emergency services had been called. Jacob nodded while continuing to comfort Eleanor, reminding her that help was only minutes away. Eleanor managed a faint smile and thanked him for hearing her voice. Those simple words settled heavily over everyone standing outside. Even the neighbors who had rarely spoken to one another suddenly shared the same uneasy feeling that something was deeply wrong with the priorities being displayed on their peaceful street. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens finally echoed through the neighborhood. Relief spread across several faces, but Patricia immediately stepped toward the curb and began waving at the arriving ambulance, as though preparing to explain the situation herself. Jacob noticed the movement and felt another knot form in his stomach. He had a growing sense that the morning's conflict was far from over because the argument was no longer about one emergency. It was becoming a test of what kind of community Maple Ridge truly wanted to be. The ambulance stopped in front of Eleanor's house, and two emergency responders stepped out carrying medical equipment with calm, practiced efficiency. One of them walked directly toward the front door while the other asked, "Who called?" Jacob immediately raised his hand. "I did. She is inside." She was able to speak, but she could not stand up. Before the responder could continue, Patricia stepped between them with her clipboard still tucked beneath one arm. "Before anyone proceeds," she said confidently, "there are neighborhood access guidelines that should be documented. The resident entered the property by crossing restricted landscaping and has already created multiple violations that the association will be reviewing." The responder paused for only a moment, looking from Patricia to Jacob with visible confusion. "Right now our priority is the resident inside," he replied politely before continuing toward the house. Patricia followed several steps behind, insisting that procedures should be respected even during unusual situations. The second responder quietly asked Jacob a series of questions about what he had observed when he first heard Eleanor call for help and whether she had mentioned any recent medical concerns. Jacob answered each question carefully, trying not to speculate. As they spoke, more neighbors gathered along the sidewalk. Nobody seemed interested in discussing lawn regulations anymore. Instead, they whispered about how strange it felt that Patricia had never once asked whether Eleanor was going to be all right. Denise folded her arms and shook her head. "I have lived here for 11 years, she quietly said to Michael. "I have never seen anyone worry more about paperwork than a neighbor." Michael glanced toward Patricia, who was still attempting to explain association procedures to anyone willing to listen. "Maybe she honestly thinks she is doing the right thing," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Across the street, 16-year-old Ryan Foster lowered the phone he had been using to record the scene. His mother noticed and asked why he had continued filming. "Because nobody is going to believe this happened if it is only one person's story," he answered. Several nearby adults exchanged thoughtful looks. They had all witnessed the same conversation from different angles. Some had security cameras mounted above their garages. Others had doorbell cameras pointing directly toward Eleanor's front yard. Quietly, almost without planning it, people began mentioning what their cameras might have captured. Denise realized her front porch camera faced almost perfectly toward Patricia and Jacob during the confrontation. Michael remembered that his driveway camera recorded audio as well as video. None of them spoke about sharing the footage immediately, but the idea settled into everyone's mind at the same time. A few minutes later, one emergency responder stepped back outside and thanked Jacob for remaining calm while waiting for help to arrive. He explained only that Eleanor would be transported for further evaluation and that she had been alert enough to answer simple questions. Relief washed over the neighborhood. Patricia, however, interrupted again. I hope everyone also understands that today's events do not excuse violations of association standards. The words hung in the warm morning air with almost unbelievable timing. No one argued with her. No one raised a voice. Instead, the silence itself became the strongest response. Neighbors who had rarely questioned Patricia's leadership suddenly looked at her differently, not with anger, but with growing doubt. For the first time since she became president of the Homeowners Association, people were no longer asking whether she had followed the rules. They were quietly beginning to ask whether she had forgotten what those rules were supposed to protect in the first place. After the ambulance disappeared around the corner, nobody hurried back inside as they normally would after an unusual event. Small groups remained on sidewalks and driveways, speaking in low voices while replaying every moment they had just witnessed. Jacob stood quietly near his mailbox, exhausted more from the emotional weight of the morning than from anything he had physically done. Patricia, meanwhile, walked from neighbor to neighbor with the confidence of someone who believed the discussion had already ended. She reminded several residents that association standards would continue to be enforced and announced that an incident report would be presented at the next board meeting. Instead of reassuring people, her words created an even greater distance between herself and the community. Denise finally broke the silence. Before anyone starts talking about reports, maybe everyone should remember there are recordings. Several heads turned toward her. She explained that her porch camera had captured nearly everything from the moment Jacob crossed the lawn until the emergency responders arrived. Michael immediately nodded. My driveway camera faces the street. It should have audio too. Ryan quietly lifted his phone again. I recorded the last several minutes myself because it felt important. Patricia smiled politely, although the expression looked forced. That is perfectly fine, she replied. The recordings will confirm that I acted according to association policy. Nobody answered. Instead, people began comparing camera angles, timestamps, and what each device might have captured. It quickly became clear that almost every important conversation had been recorded from more than one perspective. Maple Ridge Drive had become one of those modern neighborhoods where nearly every home had a doorbell camera, a security camera, or both. Without planning it, the residents had created a complete timeline of the morning. Jacob had never intended for any of this to become public. He simply wanted to know whether Eleanor was safe. When Denise asked if he wanted copies of the videos, he hesitated. Only if they become necessary, he said quietly. I do not want this turning into a fight. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the truth needs proof, especially when people remember the same event differently. Those words lingered with everyone listening. Patricia overheard the conversation and responded immediately. Truth is exactly why documentation matters. Feelings change. Written records do not. Ryan looked down at his phone before speaking carefully. Video does not change either. For the first time that morning, Patricia did not answer immediately. She simply adjusted the papers on her clipboard and reminded everyone that unauthorized sharing of association matters could create unnecessary conflict. The statement had the opposite effect. By late afternoon, neighbors who had rarely spoken beyond friendly greetings were knocking on one another's doors to compare what their cameras had captured. Each recording revealed another small detail. One showed Patricia stepping directly into Jacob's path. Another clearly captured Jacob explaining that Eleanor needed immediate help. A third recorded Patricia discussing violations while emergency responders were still arriving. No single clip told the entire story, but together they formed a remarkably consistent picture. That evening, Jacob received a phone call from the hospital. Eleanor was resting comfortably, and the staff expected her to recover well with proper care. Relief finally reached him, but it lasted only a moment before Denise texted a simple message that changed the direction of everything. The board needs to see every recording before Patricia tells them her version first. Jacob stared at the screen for several seconds, realizing the neighborhood's quiet morning had become something much larger than one emergency. The real conflict was only beginning, and this time the evidence would speak louder than anyone in the community ever could. The following morning, Maple Ridge Drive looked peaceful again, but the calm was only on the surface. Jacob returned from checking on his own yard and found 3 neighbors waiting near his driveway. Denise carried a small folder, Michael held a flash drive, and Ryan had his phone in his hand with several video files already organized by time. None of them seemed interested in creating drama. They simply wanted the facts preserved before memories could be questioned. Denise spoke first. "I watched every recording twice last night. They all tell the same story." Michael nodded. "Different angles, same sequence." Jacob accepted the flash drive, but hesitated. "I appreciate this, but I still hope the board handles everything fairly." Before anyone could respond, another resident walked across the street carrying printed copies of text messages exchanged among several neighbors immediately after the incident. Each message showed the same concern for Eleanor and the same surprise at Patricia's behavior. The evidence was growing naturally, without anyone asking people to take sides. Around noon, an electronic notice from the Homeowners Association appeared in every resident's email inbox. Patricia had scheduled a special board meeting for the following evening to discuss what she described as multiple violations committed during an unauthorized property entry. Jacob read the message twice. His name was listed as the primary subject of the meeting. There was no mention of Eleanor's medical emergency. No acknowledgement that emergency responders had been called. No expression of concern for a longtime resident. The email focused entirely on landscaping, access rules, and association compliance. Within minutes, replies began circulating privately among homeowners. Several residents expressed disbelief that the meeting agenda ignored the reason everything had happened in the first place. Denise quietly suggested that everyone who possessed recordings should attend. Michael agreed, adding that facts would matter more than opinions. That afternoon, Jacob received another welcome update from the hospital. Eleanor was recovering well and had even asked whether the neighborhood flowers outside her porch were being watered. Jacob smiled for the first time in nearly 24 hours and promised they would not be forgotten. The conversation reminded him why he had acted without hesitation. Later that day, one of the emergency responders unexpectedly stopped by the neighborhood while completing routine paperwork connected to the call. He recognized Jacob outside and thanked him again for staying with Eleanor until help arrived. Several nearby neighbors overheard the brief conversation. The responder did not discuss private medical details, but he made one observation that everyone remembered. When someone believes a neighbor needs immediate help, calling quickly and staying calm can make a meaningful difference. It was a simple statement, delivered without criticism or emotion, yet it carried far more weight than any argument heard the previous day. Patricia happened to walk outside just as the responder returned to his vehicle. She greeted him politely, but he simply wished her a good afternoon before leaving. Watching from nearby porches, residents noticed something unusual. For the first time since the incident, Patricia no longer appeared completely confident. She glanced toward the gathering neighbors, all of whom now knew multiple recordings existed. That evening, Denise created a shared folder containing every available video, each labeled by exact time. The collection formed a nearly continuous timeline from Jacob hearing Eleanor's first call until the ambulance departed. Nobody edited the recordings. Nobody added commentary. They simply preserved what had happened. As Jacob placed the flash drive into a small envelope for the board meeting, he realized the discussion ahead would no longer depend on conflicting memories. Every important moment had been quietly captured, and the truth was waiting for the right audience to see it. By the time the special Homeowners Association meeting began the following evening, the community room was fuller than anyone could remember. Residents who usually skipped every meeting had filled nearly every chair, while others quietly stood along the back wall. The atmosphere was calm, but everyone understood that this discussion would shape the future of the neighborhood. Patricia Collins sat at the front beside the other board members with a neatly organized binder and several printed violation notices. She opened the meeting with her usual confidence and thanked everyone for attending before explaining that maintaining standards required consistency, especially during unexpected situations. She then introduced Jacob's alleged violations one by one, describing his shortcut across landscaped property, his entry into Eleanor's home, and his decision to ignore repeated instructions from the association president. When she finished, She looked around the room as though expecting quiet agreement. Instead, board treasurer Alan Brooks cleared his throat and asked a simple question. Before we discuss violations, can we first acknowledge why Mr. Miller entered the property? Patricia paused briefly before replying. The circumstances do not eliminate the responsibility to follow community procedures. A noticeable silence settled over the room. Denise slowly stood and held up the flash drive containing the collected recordings. The board should see the complete timeline before making any decision, she said. Alan accepted the drive and looked toward the remaining board members, who quietly agreed. A television monitor at the front of the room was connected, and the first recording began to play. The room remained completely silent as residents watched Jacob hear Eleanor's call, cross the lawn, and explain repeatedly that she needed immediate help. Another recording followed from a different angle, clearly showing Patricia stepping into his path while discussing violations. Then came audio from Michael's driveway camera, allowing everyone to hear nearly every word exchanged before emergency responders arrived. Nobody interrupted the videos. Nobody argued over what they showed. The recordings spoke for themselves. When the final clip ended, another resident unexpectedly stood near the back of the room. Her name was Carol Simmons, and she admitted she had remained quiet for years because she disliked confrontation. This was not the first time, she said softly. She described receiving violation notices while recovering from surgery because trash containers had remained outside a few hours longer than usual. Another homeowner shared a similar story involving family medical appointments. A retired couple recalled being threatened with fines after delaying lawn maintenance during a period of serious illness. None of the stories involved dramatic accusations. Instead, they revealed a consistent pattern of rigid enforcement with very little flexibility or compassion. The board members listened carefully, occasionally exchanging concerned looks with one another. Alan finally turned toward Patricia. Were we informed about these previous situations? Patricia answered carefully. I handled them according to policy and did not believe further discussion was necessary. Another board member quietly replied. Perhaps that was the problem. The sentence lingered in the room. Patricia attempted to explain that equal enforcement prevented favoritism, but each explanation sounded less convincing after everyone had watched the recordings and heard from longtime residents. Jacob remained seated without speaking unless someone addressed him directly. He had not come to attack Patricia or embarrass anyone. He had only brought the evidence because he believed the truth deserved to be seen. As the meeting approached its final minutes, Alan announced that the board would postpone any decision regarding Jacob and instead begin a formal review of the association's emergency policies and leadership actions. For the first time since the entire situation began, Patricia no longer controlled the direction of the conversation. The community itself had quietly taken that responsibility away. The days following the board meeting felt different in ways that were impossible to ignore. Maple Ridge Drive was still quiet. Children still rode their bicycles along the sidewalks, and neighbors still collected their mail every afternoon, but conversations had changed. Instead of discussing lawn care or weekend plans, residents talked about accountability, fairness, and what kind of community they wanted to become. The board members began reviewing every recording again, this time alongside written statements from homeowners who had attended the meeting. What surprised them most was not the single incident involving Eleanor. It was how consistently the videos matched one another and how closely the personal accounts echoed the same pattern. Patricia had always defended her decisions by saying she treated everyone equally, yet more residents quietly came forward with experiences that suggested equal enforcement had gradually replaced common sense. One homeowner produced old email exchanges requesting temporary flexibility while caring for an ill family member. Another shared dated photographs showing minor violations that had resulted in immediate warnings despite clearly explained circumstances. None of the situations alone seemed extraordinary, but together they painted a picture of leadership that valued procedure above practical judgment. Alan Brooks spent hours organizing the material into a timeline for the rest of the board. Every document was carefully dated, every recording labeled, every statement signed. The goal was not to embarrass anyone, but to understand whether the association had drifted away from its original purpose. Patricia continued insisting she had simply enforced the governing documents exactly as written. During a follow-up meeting with the board, She argued that making exceptions invited inconsistency and favoritism. Alan listened respectfully before asking a question that left the room silent. If the rules exist to serve the community, what happens when the community believes the rules are no longer serving them? Patricia did not answer immediately. Instead, she repeated that emotions should never influence enforcement decisions. Meanwhile, Jacob visited Eleanor after she returned home. She was recovering well, moving more carefully than before, but smiling as warmly as ever. She thanked him again for responding when he heard her voice and admitted she had worried less about herself than about the argument unfolding outside her front door. Jacob assured her that everyone simply wanted the neighborhood to learn from what had happened. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "A good neighbor remembers people before policies," she said quietly. Those words stayed with Jacob long after he returned home. Later that evening, Alan called him with an update. The board had completed its preliminary review and reached one unanimous conclusion. Every violation notice issued against Jacob during the incident would be withdrawn immediately because the circumstances clearly involved a genuine emergency. More importantly, the board intended to schedule a community vote regarding Patricia's continued leadership after completing its full investigation. Jacob thanked Alan but made one request. "Please keep the focus on improving the neighborhood. I never wanted this to become personal." Alan agreed, explaining that the board shared the same goal. News of the withdrawn violations spread quickly through Maple Ridge Drive, bringing a sense of relief to many residents who had quietly feared the evidence might still be ignored. Instead, confidence in the review process began to grow. For the first time since the morning Eleanor called for help, the balance of trust had shifted. Patricia still held the title of association president, but the confidence that once surrounded her authority had almost completely disappeared, replaced by something she could no longer control, a community that had seen the truth with its own eyes and was no longer willing to look away. 1 week later, the community clubhouse filled even earlier than it had for the previous meeting. This time there was no uncertainty about why everyone had come. The board had completed its review, and every homeowner had received a copy of the proposed policy changes before walking through the doors. Jacob quietly took a seat near the middle of the room beside Michael and Denise, while Eleanor, now feeling much stronger, arrived with the help of a lightweight walking cane. As neighbors noticed her enter, many stood to greet her with warm smiles. Patricia remained at the front of the room, but the confidence that once defined every meeting had been replaced by visible restraint. Alan Brooks opened the session by thanking residents for their patience throughout the review process. He carefully explained that the board had examined every recording, every written statement, every association document, and every relevant communication submitted by homeowners. Rather than focusing on personalities, the review had focused on decisions, responsibilities, and whether the association had acted in a manner consistent with the values it claimed to represent. Alan then announced the first official decision. All violation notices connected to the incident had been permanently removed from the association records. A quiet round of applause spread through the room. Jacob simply nodded, clearly relieved but unwilling to celebrate at anyone else's expense. The second announcement carried even greater weight. The board had unanimously recommended immediate leadership changes based on the findings that repeated decisions had demonstrated poor judgment during exceptional circumstances and had damaged trust between the association and its residents. Patricia was invited to address the community before any vote was held. She stood slowly and looked across the familiar faces she had worked with for years. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, she admitted that she had believed strict consistency protected the neighborhood better than individual judgment. She insisted she had never intended to disregard anyone's well-being, but she also acknowledged that listening had gradually become less important than enforcing procedures. It was not a dramatic speech, nor did it erase what had happened, but it was the first time many residents had heard her reflect instead of defend. After she finished, Alan opened the floor for brief comments. Denise thanked the board for reviewing the evidence fairly. Michael reminded everyone that strong communities were built through trust, not fear of receiving notices in the mailbox. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair, and the room immediately became silent. She smiled gently before speaking. "The first person who reached me that morning was not thinking about rules. He was thinking about his neighbor. I hope we never lose that again." Her words settled over the room with remarkable calm. No one applauded immediately because nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. When the vote was finally conducted, the result was decisive. The recommendation passed by an overwhelming margin. Patricia quietly accepted the outcome without argument, thanked the board members for their service together, and left the front table with quiet dignity. Alan then introduced an interim leadership team until a new election could be organized. The first policy they approved required that any genuine emergency involving health or safety would always take priority over routine association enforcement. As residents slowly left the clubhouse that evening, conversations felt lighter than they had in weeks. Jacob walked beside Eleanor toward the parking lot, and she smiled at him once more. Neither of them spoke about winning or losing. They simply appreciated that compassion had finally found its rightful place at the center of the neighborhood they both called home. Over the next several weeks, Maple Ridge Drive slowly returned to the peaceful rhythm that had once defined it, but the neighborhood itself had changed in ways that everyone could feel. The new interim board invited homeowners to participate in open discussions instead of simply receiving notices in their mailboxes. Meetings became conversations rather than lectures, and residents who had once stayed silent began offering ideas for improving the community. One of the first changes was the adoption of a clear emergency response policy stating that health and safety would always come before routine enforcement. Copies of the new guidelines were delivered to every home, and for the first time in years, people read an association document with genuine appreciation instead of quiet frustration. Eleanor continued recovering each day, and before long, she was once again sitting on her front porch with a cup of tea, waving at neighbors as they passed. Her return became a symbol of something larger than her own recovery. It reminded everyone that a neighborhood was not measured by perfectly trimmed lawns or matching mailboxes, but by the willingness of ordinary people to care for one another when it mattered most. Jacob never sought recognition for what he had done. He returned to his normal routine, watering his flowers before work, greeting familiar faces, and checking on Eleanor whenever he noticed her porch light glowing in the evening. Yet people treated him differently now. Children smiled and waved as they rode past on bicycles. New residents introduced themselves instead of hurrying indoors. Longtime neighbors stopped to thank him, not because he had challenged the association, but because he had reminded them what being a good neighbor actually meant. Even Patricia's departure eventually became part of the community's healing rather than a source of bitterness. There were no celebrations at her expense and no cruel gossip after she stepped away from leadership. Instead, many residents quietly reflected on how easy it was for good intentions to become lost when procedures replaced compassion. The experience became an important lesson rather than a lasting division. Months later, during the annual neighborhood picnic, Alan Brooks addressed the crowd with a brief welcome before inviting everyone to enjoy the afternoon together. He looked around at families sharing homemade food, children playing games on the common lawn, and neighbors laughing together under the warm summer sun. Then he smiled and said, "A strong community is not built because every rule is followed perfectly. It is built because people know they can depend on one another." The applause that followed came naturally because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Jacob glanced toward Eleanor, who lifted her lemonade with a grateful smile, before quietly returning to her conversation with Denise and Michael. There were no headlines, no dramatic speeches, and no grand celebrations. Life simply moved forward with a renewed sense of trust. The recordings that had once exposed painful truths were archived and forgotten, while the lessons they revealed became part of the neighborhood's identity. Years later, new families moving into Maple Ridge Drive would hear many stories about block parties, holiday decorations, and friendly neighbors willing to lend a helping hand. They would never know every detail of the morning that changed everything, but they would immediately notice the culture it created. Doors opened more quickly when someone needed assistance. Conversations began with kindness before criticism. And whenever anyone wondered what truly held the neighborhood together, the answer was never found in a rulebook. It was found in the simple decision to place people first every single time.